Welcome back to part 2 of the workshop on addiction denial. And just to recap quickly, we had a look on the previous video, the difference between denial and addiction denial. And then we can see that there is quite a big difference between the two. We get an idea of how the addiction can twist that mechanism within an individual, turning it into something that can be quite deadly for the addict and the alcoholic. So in this next section, we're going to start looking at actual denial mechanisms, and depending on how much time it takes, might be another 2, maybe 3 parts. Let's look at a definition of denial in the context of addiction. If an individual does not believe that substance abuse is a problem for them, they will be unlikely to change their behavior. Even if the destruction caused by the addiction is obvious to everybody else, it may not be so obvious to the addict. That's an important note. I want to come back to that. This is because one of the symptoms of addiction is denial. The individual may have a host of explanations for why their life is in such a mess, but denial means that they are unable to consider the real culprit. And that's where the denial mechanisms come into play. As addicts and alcoholics, we have a whole barrage full of denial mechanisms for any eventuality, any situation, any challenge, any person, any circumstance. And you'll see more what I mean a little further on. So long as the individual is unable to see beyond their denial, they will not have the motivation to stay sober. If they do manage to quit, it will only be to please other people and unlikely to last long. And working in a treatment center, we've seen this time and time and time again. It's empirically tested that if we cannot break through somebody's denial, very strong probability they're going to leave treatment under a deadly perception that they're in some sort of recovery. Very probably going to end up being dry drunk. Whatever superficial dynamics that they've taken on are not going to stand under the weight of life on life's terms. Okay. It may shock you to hear that a lot of people, a significant amount of people, come into treatment to protect the addiction rather than deal with the addiction. They come under duress, they are coerced, or they're trying to escape their consequences, but they've not really finished with the relationship that we discussed, that we looked at in the previous video. With obvious outcomes. They'll very probably go through the program doing treatment. We're like chameleons. We can adapt very quickly, learn how to do the program, learn how it works, and do the program without really making any significant changes, doing it all intellectually, all in the head, without really actualizing anything they learn into practical changes of behavior, go under a deadly belief system that somehow just being in rehab or being in treatment is going to qualify them for recovery. That when they leave, if they spend 28 days or 2 months or 3 months or however long amount of time in the treatment center, that when they leave, they're going to be in recovery. And often that's not the case. They go home with a loud mouth, flapping their gums about everything that they've learned, projecting a lot of it onto the people around them. Will start going to meetings, become Captain Recovery, and for somebody that's not savvy to addiction denial, it can actually look and sound quite impressive. But the reality is it's a big hollow drum. It's very shallow, and is not going to survive the weight of life on life terms. Life on life terms is like the four horsemen of the apocalypse, galloping at you from all directions. And you'll feel like General Custer. And as I say General Custer, I probably think very few people today know who General Custer was. But go Google General Custer and how he died, and you'll get an idea of what a General Custer moment is. And the question you can ask is, what was the last thing General Custer said before he died? And it was, where did all those Indians come from? Anyway, we digress. Addiction denial is a very formidable dynamic. If you're watching this clip, you're going to come up, and you may have already come up against the questions in the written step work. Okay, you have to pause here and give it the time that it deserves. You have to dig deep. Okay, a superficial understanding of the blueprint of denial. You know, oh, I get it, I understand it. Oh, rationalizing, yes, I know what that means. Oh, comparing, yes, I used to do that. Oh, blaming, yes, I used to blame the world. And without getting specific, okay, without pausing long enough to get specific about how you actually did that. What was your flavor of denial? Because everybody's flavor is going to be different. The blueprint is just a blueprint, okay, and you're not going to get clean off any blueprints. Every lecture that you watch here on ehab.care, every talk, every podcast you listen to, you've got to go away and reflect on, what does this say about me? What's my version of this? How do I do this? How does this translate into behavior in my context? Okay, you absolutely have to do this. It's key. Okay, so let's go forward. Let's have a look at some mechanisms. We'll maybe pause the video again, give you time to process and think about it, and then we'll have a look at the rest of the denial mechanisms. Addiction denial mechanisms. First one is simple or absolute denial, and it works like this. You're an addict. No, I'm not. You're in denial. No, I'm not. You're out of control. No, I'm not. It sounds simple, but it's formidable, and it continues to crazy making. Contributes to crazy making. And a bit further on in the mechanisms, I'll explain more what crazy making means. Minimizing, where we make the problem seem smaller than it is. Only use on weekends. I'm only smoking half joints. I'm only doing small lines. At least I'm not injecting. Somehow you're going to make the problem seem smaller than it is. How do you do it? What does it sound like when you do it? Rationalizing, self-delusion. Okay, now rationalizing and justifying work together. And often people confuse the two. And I've just noticed I've got different fonts. Not fonts, caps and no low caps. Oh, anyway, try not to notice that. Rationalizing is how I convince myself. How do I make it sound okay? How do I create an environment within my thinking that I can use? Justifying is how I'm going to make that sound right to the people around me. Okay? Colin's terminology here is making wrong sound right, making right sound wrong. Beautiful terminology. Absolutely coins what justifying is all about. How do I, well, if you were married to the person I was married, you would also drink. justification. Rationalizing and justifying. How do you do it? What does that look like in your life? Blaming, accusing. Blaming means I'm going to blame my behavior on somebody or something else. It's because you were such a terrible parent. It was because I was neglected. It was because I was bullied. It was because somebody died. And we can actually be quite mercenary with this. And this is something that I did. And I've come across it quite often working with other addicts and alcoholics, is that if we've got past trauma, I'm a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, and that used to be my get out of free jail card. You know, as soon as all my other denial mechanisms weren't working, I'd whip that one out. Well, you weren't abused as a child, you know, and that would just shut everybody up immediately. Nobody knows where to go with that. Okay. Now, because I did that, didn't make the trauma any less. It didn't negate any of the trauma. I still had to go and do the work on the trauma. Okay. And I did a lot of work on that, and I'm in a good place with it now in my later adult life, and I do work with people that have trauma. So just bear that in mind if at some point you want to talk about past trauma. So blaming and accusing. Who do we blame? People, places, things. Okay, you've got to personalize that. What does that narrative sound like in your head? Okay, because you're first going to do it in here, then it's going to come out there. And it's going to be often very, very convincing. But the reality is blaming is just going to turn you into a victim. And the more you do it, you'll start wearing that as an identity, and nothing will change in your life because you're waiting for something exterior or external to change before you're going to feel okay. You're waiting for somebody to come and say sorry. You're waiting to be vindicated. You're waiting for something else to make you feel okay, and it's never going to happen. There's two Christian psychologists, Dr. Henry Cloud and Dr. John Townsend. I think it's in their Boundaries course. They say something hugely significant, and when I understood this, it was a paradigm shift for me in my own thinking. No matter what happened to me in my life, no matter the trauma, no matter how bad it was, no matter the damage, okay, the responsibility to heal from it belongs exclusively to me. I have to do the work. Okay? Somewhere in another talk in the not too distant future, I'm going to go into more detail. I'll maybe do a podcast or something that will talk more in depth about trauma and blame and victim and all of that. So before we digress, let's stick with addiction denial mechanisms. Diversion. Now, what is diversion? Diversion is, I'm going to change the subject somehow. A classic diversion statement is no but you. It's formidable. No but you. You're such an addict. No, but what about you? You so this, but what about you? No but you. Contributes to crazy making. Very powerful. Have you heard that coming out of your mouth? I'm pretty sure you have. What, who and when and what were the circumstances of those statements? Who was challenging you? Okay? How did you throw that back in there? How did you push that back in their mouth? Bargaining. Well, if my circumstances change, I won't have to use as much. Well, if you weren't such a nag, I wouldn't isolate and drink so much. How do we bargain? We find a way to play the ball back into somebody else's court, that if this changes, if you change, if you stop doing this, then I won't have to do this. Okay, and we're very clever with it, we're very cunning with it, contributes to crazy making. Passivity, where we'll just roll with the blows. We agree with everything. Don't, yes, sir, no, sir. But take no considerable action or take no responsibility for everything. It's just this passive lump of defiance. And it sounds simple, but it's formidable, contributes to crazy making. Regression, where we will go back in age. Some of us will use a little girl voice or a little boy voice, or a little girl, a little boy mannerisms, to try and change the person who's challenging us demeanor or tone, and get them on my side, to manipulate them. So regression, powerful. How do you do it? Do you do it? Who do you do it with? Because it might work on mom, it's not going to work on dad. Very probably part of a drama triangle strategy, where you splitting people in your household. Hostility. And there's lots of ways that we can do hostility. Violence, sulking, punishing. Violence, we can smash things, break things, kick holes in things. And what we do, what the message is when we do that, is that if you don't back off, I'm going to do this to you. And some might even go as far as to get physically violent with somebody to shut them up. Okay? Sulking is another act of violence. Have you ever sat with somebody that sulks? How does that feel? Okay? It's hostile, yeah? You're walking on eggshells. Us addicts, we take this next level. We can do this for weeks, months. We can get everybody on eggshells. We determine the tone and the atmosphere of the home. It's traumatizing. And we can do it long enough, we can do it significantly enough, where we start to traumatize people with it. They start developing post-traumatic stress. We can punish people by withholding attention, love, sex, money. We can find ways to punish people. How do you do this? How does the hostility work in your denial mechanisms? Because I don't think anybody's exempt from this when it comes to addiction denial. I think everybody has got a hostile take or a hostile angle to this. Be honest, dig deep, give details. Affiliation, splitting. I'm mentioning that just before. And essentially what this is we will go and get people on our side. We'll manipulate and control members of the family to support our position. We've manipulated them enough, we've convinced them enough that the problem isn't that real, and that whoever's challenging me is over-challenging me, is being a bully or whatever. Okay? Go and Google the drama triangle. I'll do a lecture or a talk or a podcast soon. Now on the drama triangle, I'll put a link in the description below when I've done it. But go look at the drama triangle. Okay? We split families. We split parents. We get people on our side against the persecutor, the person that's challenging us, and it can absolutely scuttle families, rips families apart. I've seen this absolutely devastate families because of families' inability to see it, or not wanting to see it, or unwilling to consider being a bit tougher. Heavy stuff, man. How do you do it? Who are you splitting? Who's the rescuer and who's the persecutor in your arena of addiction? Go there, talk about it, give details. We're going to leave it there. Take those few, process, think about it, and I will see you back with part 3. Maybe we finish with part 3, maybe there's a part 4. But that's enough to chew on, enough to think about for now. Next one, we'll be looking at some more mechanisms. Thanks, guys.